Hey, welcome everybody. It's great to be back at the Science Institute, and I had a great time in the first session and the career session. If you missed the first session with Megan Badish, go back and take a look at it on YouTube. But really, as you know, the theme of this series, or as you may know, is really the importance of strategic empathy. The ability to view complex challenges and opportunities from the perspective of others, and to understand the emotions and the ideologies and the aspirations that drive and constrain other actors. If we don't have strategic empathy, we trend toward strategic narcissism, and we tend to define these challenges and opportunities that we face mainly abroad in connection with our foreign policy and national security strategy only from the perspective of ourselves, right? And this is a problem because it's self-referential, and it doesn't really recognize the degree that others have agency and influence and authorship over the future. So today's theme is strategic empathy, and we're going to use our policy and our understanding of Russia as an example. And we could not have a better guest to help us do that, and to have a discussion about the Kremlin's policy, what we might call Putin's playbook, as he applies it against the United States and Europe, and the West broadly. Then Fiona Hill. And Dr. Fiona Hill is a great friend. Welcome, Fiona. It's great to have you here. I'll just tell you a little bit about her background, and then what I'll do is I'll make a short presentation here. I'll turn it over to Fiona for a short presentation, and then we're very anxious to hear where you'd like to take the discussion. But first, what I'd like to say is that Fiona is somebody who provides a great example, a great example of a career of service and a career in academia. Her career is an example that, hey, you don't have to pick one thing and stick with it. You can move back and forth and pursue your interests and make significant contributions across a career of service and scholarship. And Fiona grew up in northeastern England. She went to St. Andrews in Scotland, during which time she studied in the Soviet Union. She came to the United States in 1989, just as the Berlin Wall fell and the Soviet Union began to break apart, and it was of course the end of the Cold War. And then she was for 10 years at Harvard University, where she obtained her master's and her doctorate, and she worked at the Kennedy School and with Graham Allison on a number of programs there. She joined the Eurasia Foundation after that, and then she was 20 years at Brookings, but she was at Brookings, which is as you know, a well-regarded think tank in Washington, running the center for U.S. and Europe. But she also committed to government service twice during that period as the National Intelligence Officer at the Defense Intelligence Agency, at DNI, the Director for National Intelligence, from 2006 to 2009. And then when I got to work with her, when she was Senior Director for Europe and Russia on the National Security Council staff. And she was just a pleasure to work with. I learned so much from her in that position. And I think many of you got to see her very moving and poignant and important testimony during the impeachment trial of President Trump, associated with the issues around Ukraine. She has a book coming out, and it's going to be a great book. I know it's called "There is Nothing for You Here: Opportunity in an Age of Decline," and so I think she'd be happy to answer questions you have about the book as well. Hey, but Fiona, welcome, and to all of you, welcome. What I'll do is I'll start with just a really discussion of strategic narcissism, strategic empathy, and how it applied to Russia. And as I mentioned, it's really important for us to view complex challenges that we face abroad from the perspective of others. And a way to do that is to always challenge, I think, challenge the assumptions that underpin policies and strategies. And so what we always try to do on the National Security Council staff is to identify even those implicit assumptions, really, that go unwritten, unspoken, and therefore unchallenged. And as we did this with Russia, we really determined that across multiple administrations, the George W. Bush administration, the Obama administration, and I think in retrospect, at least from the president's perspective, the Trump administration had approached Russia under the assumption that Vladimir Putin and the Kremlin would conclude, hey, your interests lie with the West and with Europe and the United States. And once the Kremlin realized this, they would moderate their behavior. They would maybe curtail greatly or even stop their disruptive campaign, their campaign of political subversion and political warfare against the West and the United States, rejoin the community of nations, and as a result, prosper and improve security for all of us, and identify opportunities for multinational cooperation, and we could take on some of the world's greatest challenges together. Well, all three of those administrations, presidents at least, experienced, I think, disappointment, and the reason was because they undervalued, I think, they undervalued the degree, again, to which emotion and aspiration and ideology drove and constrained Vladimir Putin. Now, Fiona has written, I think, the best book on Putin and his mindset, so I won't go into too much detail. But what we concluded is that Putin was driven mainly by a sense of honor lost after the end of the Cold War, and an associated drive to restore Russia to national greatness. He was also driven by a more practical concern of maintaining his position of power on top of really what is, you might think of as a protection network where he's got dirt on everybody. And so for those who are powerful in the country, the so-called oligarchs and the old Siloviki, the old intelligence and defense elites from the Cold War period, who have become more and more influential in the Kremlin, that they were motivated by maintaining their position of power, and Putin was the one who could be the real power broker in Russia. And so if Russia, a country really with limited resources, right, an economy that's only the size of Italy's or Texas's economy, wants to restore Russia to national greatness, how does he do it kind of on the cheap? And what we conclude is that really, what Vladimir Putin is determined to do is to drag everybody else down, right? Rather than build Russia up, Putin is operating under the theory that he'll be sort of the figurative last man standing. And he's doing it through what we might describe as a campaign of disruption, disinformation, denial, and a strategy in which he employs disruptive technologies, from disruptive military technologies to counter what he sees as our differential advantages, the development of these kind of crazy nuclear capabilities, and a disruptive and dangerous nuclear doctrine, but especially information warfare, cyber-enabled information warfare, to drag us down by reducing our confidence in our common identity as Americans, by polarizing us and pitting us against each other, and in particular, diminishing our confidence in our democratic principles and institutions and processes. And Russia is at this in Europe, to divide societies within Europe and pit them against each other, but also to break apart any kind of sense of European Union, and then, of course, to rend the transatlantic relationship. Pit us against each other, keep us divided and weakened against, so Russia can be sort of and Putin can be the last man standing. So what did we do about it? Well, we decided, okay, well, we have to defend better against Russian new generation warfare, as it's been termed by some. And one of the ways to do that is to harden our systems, right, to defend against cyber-enabled information warfare, to protect elections in particular. And there have been a lot of gains there. And I think Dr. Hill will talk about some of those gains that we made in securing our election process, which of course has been at the forefront of our minds ever since President Trump's denial of the election results, the sowing of conspiracy theories, and then the encouragement of an assault on the Capitol on January 6th, which was heartbreaking for all of us. But of course, the president was aiding and abetting Putin in this, right? Because this campaign is to disrupt us, right? Which he succeeded at doing, and then to sow doubts, right? To sow doubts with disinformation that you would hope our leaders, our politicians counter. So a big part of our defense is to expect more of our political leadership, such that we demand that they not compromise our principles, not compromise our confidence in our institutions to score partisan political points. And Dr. Hill might talk about this, but there have been examples of this within both political parties, not to suggest any equivalencies between them, but I think in general, we have to expect more from our political leadership. I think also to defend against this disinformation, we have to do better ourselves, right? In our confidence in authoritative sources of information. I think we should at least all agree that it's lamentable that if you lean in one direction politically, you watch one cable news station. If you lean in another direction politically, you watch one of two others. We don't come together with a common basis of information, a common base of knowledge, so we can have respectful, meaningful discussions about the challenges we face. Because I really think that if we were more knowledgeable about these challenges and we started conversations with what we agree on, heck, we can get a lot done together, right, across any kind of partisan or political divides. And then, of course, we have the compounding problem, of the pseudo media and how these kind of crazy conspiracy theories operate unchecked. And then social media makes it even worse, right? Because with social media's business model is to show all of us, hey, more and more extreme content. You know why? Because that gets more clicks and that gets more advertising money. And so really we're vulnerable, and we have to get better at defending ourselves. I would say, the signed fellowship, this kind of interaction, and just education broadly, what you're doing at American University in the most politically involved student body in the country is so important. Because we in the last session we did on careers, we had the campus Democrats and Republicans together and asking questions. It was just really a vibrant discussion. That's what we need. And I think American University, and I hope this fellowship is a big part of the defense, right, against Vladimir Putin. But then also, when Dr. Hill and I were working on this, we concluded, hey, we have to impose costs on Vladimir Putin that go beyond what he factored in at the outset of his decisions. And so I thought I'd just use one example of how we did that, consistent with a strategy that Dr. Hill developed. March 23rd of 2018 was my last really big substantive day in the Oval Office. I was kind of, frankly, on my last legs in the job. I knew it. President Trump and I had conversations about it. And I knew that I just had probably, a month left or so, if that, in the job. And it was on that date that we were presenting to the president options in response to the Kremlin's poisoning of Sergei Skripal and his daughter in an attempted assassination using a banned nerve agent. Sound familiar? Well, this fits the pattern associated with the assassination attempt on Mr. Navalny more recently. So I just thought I'd give you a quick timeline to see, kind of what we did in this period of time. The poisoning occurred on the 4th of March. On the 6th of March, I talked to my counterpart, Mark Sedwell, a dear friend. I mean, relationships really matter, at that level, between national security advisors and the White House and 10 Downing Street. And we put together an approach. We put together an approach that our teams followed up on, which was to galvanize a multinational response to this attack on a NATO ally using a banned nerve agent. We began to make a lot of phone calls. Dr. Hill, remember, we were on the phone almost constantly in this period of time. But we had a lot of intel work to do, right? We had to verify, and get other intelligence services to also verify that this could be traced back to Russian labs. Secretary Tillerson made a statement, Secretary of State Tillerson at the time, on the 12th of March, saying that we agree with the UK, that this is attributed to the Russians. President Trump made a similar comment the next day on the 13th. But then, as you might recall, on the 20th of March, this was I know Dr. Hill recalled, you probably won't recall, anybody else, that someone leaked this, the preparation for a phone call between President Trump and Vladimir Putin, in which President Trump congratulated Putin for his rigged election victory in Russia. But so that was the environment when we went into the Oval Office on the 23rd, with the senior representatives from each of the departments and agencies sitting around the couches in the Oval Office. And what we did is we presented to President Trump multiple options that in context of the objectives for our overall Russian policy, right? To defend better against Russian new generation warfare, but also to impose costs on Putin to restore deterrence, right? To costs that go beyond what he might factor in at the beginning of that process. My deputy, Rick Waddell, he read out the options in the Oval Office, and the president made a decision. I think an important decision to hit Vladimir Putin kind of where it hurts, right? To expel a number of undeclared intelligence officers and to close a very important intelligence collection platform for them, one oriented on Silicon Valley. It's in their consulate in San Francisco. So I just thought it'd be useful to give that as an example of what we've been talking about in the previous session. And previously I've talked about the duties of a national security advisor. There are 5 key ones, I think. One is to staff the president, to help the president think through issues involving foreign policy and national security. The second is to run a process that gives the president options, multiple options, and then assists with the sensible implementation, effective implementation of his policies and decisions. The third is to communicate the president's decisions, the results that come out of his decisions and actions. I did so in a speech at the Atlantic Council on the Russia policy about a week after this. And then also to ensure unity of effort internationally, right? To work with our partners and our allies. And Dr. Hill might talk more about that. This is what I mentioned on the phone call. And then finally, to lead an organization, the National Security Council staff, and hopefully lead that organization effectively. So, hey, I'll stop there. But what I wanted to highlight was I think our approach to Russia is an example of the need to employ strategic empathy to overcome strategic narcissism. It is an example of the importance of identifying and challenging assumptions. And it is, I think, also important in connection with understanding how to defend against forms of aggression that fall below those actions that might elicit a concerted military response. This is gray zone conflict or Russian new generation warfare. And I thought I'd just give you an insight into a timeline associated with the presidential decision that really spanned longer than I thought, Fiona, when I look back to look at it, between the 4th of March and the president's decision on the 23rd of March. So, Dr. Hill, it is great to have you here. Welcome. And I look forward to hearing what you have to say. I just want to first say, any of you have questions, please put them in the Q&A now. And I'll screen those as Dr. Hill is talking. Of course, I'll be paying attention very closely as well, Fiona. And then I'll post questions to Dr. Hill based on what you send in the Q&A function. Fiona, welcome. Thank you.
Thank you so much, HR. It's really great to be here, and great to be with the group from American University as well. As I'm just sort of sitting up the road from American University, obviously it's a shame we can't be there in person, but in any case, it's nice even to be here virtually. I thought I would actually just make a few quick comments to pick up on some of the points that you've made, because I think it looks like we have over 50 attendees here. Only a few questions popping up in the Q&A, but I mean, this is really an opportunity for those of you who are taking part in this class to weigh in and kind of ask about things that are on your mind. I do want to make just a very quick plug for a Brookings event later on this afternoon that some of you might find of interest based on what General McMaster has just said about the importance of fixing ourselves. Because, again, one of the main points that comes out of our experience at the National Security Council and seeing the aftermath of the 2016 election interference by Russia is that Russia didn't invent any of the problems that the United States faces, but what it did is exploit the divisions. And I do actually want to make a little comment about that, the difference between how Putin operates at home and how he operates abroad in trying to, drag us down. And I do think that, one of the first orders for being able to push back on some of the Russian activity is to figure out how we knit ourselves back together, how we get back to being the United States. And Brookings has an event that's beginning this afternoon focused on these ideas of reconciliation. And there's a couple of panels that I think people will find, very interesting, especially as we're meeting today against the backdrop of something rather unexpected, a second impeachment, coming out of the storming of a Capitol building, by many people who had just been at one of the president's rallies. So this is a big day. And that whole theme about how do we achieve national reconciliation is a very important one. And that leads directly into, kind of that point of strategic empathy and about thinking about Russia that I want to make. Because Vladimir Putin came into power in 2000 as a kind of a restorationist, and make Russia great again. I mean, in many respects, he's the first populist president of the 21st century, kind of basically feeding off people's grievances and, trying to kind of put the country back on its feet again after the collapse of the Soviet Union in, that period of the early 1990s. And then, what turned out to be some failed attempts at economic and political reform in Russia in the course of the 1990s. Now, some of the reform attempts did actually work, and Russia became a market economy, but it became a particular kind of market economy, as General McMaster's, pointed out. It became more of a kind of kleptocracy and an oligarchy. So the market reforms worked. There was a privatization of state-held assets, the big heavy industries, in mining and steelworks and metallurgy, and also, other parts of the state sector. But what really failed was the rule of law. And there was a basic an acquisition of a lot of these, the big the companies, the commanding heights of the economy by people who were close, not just to Putin, that came along eventually, but to the first president of an independent Russia, Boris Yeltsin and his family. And very early on, the state itself was pretty weak. Russia was bankrupt. And so the oligarchs, the people who acquired the business assets, some of them had been former ministers, but others had just been fairly cronies, associates of kind of people close to the government. They also started to take political power for themselves. And when Putin came in 2000 to replace Boris Yeltsin, he was the person who was selected by Boris Yeltsin. Initially, the family or the associates around Yeltsin thought they could control Putin. Putin had kind of come up the back corridors of power. He's a product of the deep state, but he also came from a very humble background. He came from a very hard scrabble family who had not been part of the Communist Party. The closest that the family had kind of got to power was one of his relatives was Stalin's cook. Clearly that was a bit of a dangerous job to be, because if anything went wrong with the food, that would literally off to the gulag. So it wasn't exactly particularly auspicious start. And he lived in a communal apartment, one of these buildings that was divided up among multiple families, sharing everything from the bathroom, to the kitchen facilities. It was a pretty tough life. And the way that Putin got ahead was, benefited from the expansion of education, went to university in Leningrad, St. Petersburg, his hometown, but he decided to join the KGB as a way of getting ahead. So that's kind of a sort of a different way of approaching opportunity than, most of us would do. And, he rises up and he's not especially successful at the very beginning. And, of course, he bemoans in some of his speeches the collapse of the Soviet Union, which brought down the state for the second time in the 20th century after the Russian Revolution. But actually, he benefits immensely from that. He wouldn't have become president without the collapse of the state, because he goes from the KGB, perhaps never really leaving the KGB, to work in the mayor's office in St. Petersburg in the 1990s. And the mayor is his former law school professor. So, those of you who are at American University, sometimes your professors end up doing something much more interesting than you would think. And he becomes the deputy mayor, and he's in charge of all this business development. So that's how a lot of his ties start out. He is in charge of giving out licenses and all kinds of permissions, for property and for businesses and business development in St. Petersburg. And he makes all these friends and ties with all kinds of people from his childhood, and then all these new businesses. And that all helps propel him forward into Moscow in the 1990s, into the Yeltsin circles. And eventually he becomes the head of the KGB, which he could never have envisaged being, in his previous position. And then from there, he gets in charge of the, at different points, he's in charge of the Kremlin property administration as well. So he sees how everything works with all the kind of perks and doling out the perks. And from there, he's sort of selected as a prime minister and then as acting president. And everybody thinks that they can control him, but really he's super ambitious, and he's just been hiding this behind the facade of, the grey man in the suit, moving up through the KGB. And anyway, in 2000, when he becomes the president, he makes this big speech. It's the sort of the eve, it's the millennium eve, it's the very last day of 1999, the beginning of 2000. And he lays out basically a manifesto, a platform for making Russia great again. First focusing on making the country solvent after it's become bankrupt. And he actually does that pretty successfully. But he really benefits from this huge increase in the value of oil and gas at that time. Oil and gas prices start to mount. And his first time in the presidency has really benefited from just huge demand from all of Russia's natural resources. And then, very careful plan of putting the finances back together again. Sounds familiar? It's kind of something that we need to do today too, against the backdrop of COVID. But really, what Putin does is restores the country. And he also focuses on unity, because the country was being pulled apart in the 1990s. There was the secession of Chechnya in the North Caucasus, a war there, the largest, in fact, military action on Russian soil since World War II. And it's a civil war of Russia trying to bring Chechnya back into the fold again. There's all kinds of emergence of terrorist groups. There's all other efforts to not just secede, but to pull away from Moscow for all the different regions. And Putin has to focus on unity. And this is what I wanted to, kind of make the tie today, where we've been in a period of incredible divisiveness. Because part of Putin making Russia great again was to pull the country together. And I mean, he did it by making it solvent, first of all, and economic reconstruction. This is before all of the, the bad behavior in the foreign policy world that General McMaster has just kind of run over. Because at first, Russia doesn't have the ability to do things. It doesn't have the ability to flex its muscles internationally, because it's very vulnerable and very dependent. It's vulnerable on the economic front, on the political front, because it's being pulled apart internally. And it's dependent on loans from the World Bank and other international organizations, and it's heavily indebted. And Putin has to figure out a way of paying off those debts before he can even start to build up the military and to do things internationally. But unity becomes critical, because the reason that the Soviet Union fell apart was all the divisions, political divisions, ethnic divisions, religious divisions, disagreements about how the Soviet Union should be run, and the same with the Russian Empire. The Russian Empire is also pulled apart by the same national tensions of, various regions that are not ethnically Russian, religious tensions, social tensions, political tensions. And so Putin tries to create a kind of a sense of being Russian, a larger grandeur, restoring Russia as a great power, but also giving everyone a stake. And, in many respects, if, Putin had stopped there by the end of that first decade of being in power, we might have actually looked back and thought of him as one of the great leaders of Russia, because he did knit the country back together again. And, what we've seen, though, in the last 10 years, I mean, remember, Putin's now been in power for 20 years, either as president or prime minister, is that, once the debts were paid off and he'd made Russia great again at home, he starts to kind of think again about foreign policy. And what he tries to do is stoke divisions abroad. And this is, kind of obviously, again, a big difference between what he did at home and what he did overseas. And it again underscores this point that General McMaster was making about our vulnerabilities when we're divided, because Putin knows himself that when Russia's divided, when Russia is weak, Russia can very easily fall apart, not just be subject to external pressures. Now we're seeing, however, in 2020 that everything that Putin has done up until now is under question, because just like us, they've been hit by COVID-19, the major pandemic. They haven't dealt with it particularly well. We just saw statistically in the last couple of days, they've got the information in on the death rate over the normal over the last year. And it's clear that they completely undercounted deaths from COVID. It's nothing like the United States, of course, but it is, up there and, where you don't want to be in the top 3 or 4 of countries with, kind of a very high death rate from COVID-19. They've had some success with Sputnik, which is great, in terms of global vaccination, but they don't have the production capacity, to really kind of ramp up, their vaccination attempts. So they'll need to, partner with others. But they've also hit economic stagnation. That first 10 years of basically building up the country through oil and gas revenues has really ground to a halt. That growth model doesn't work anymore. And, the world's going green, or going to have to go green with climate change. So, though Russia still has masses of oil and gas, that's still not going to be able to be the growth engine for looking ahead. You've also got the fact, of course, that it's become a massive kleptocracy. And, recently, there's a lot more evidences have emerged of just the kind of scale of self-enrichment that Putin has engaged in. I mean, there was writings about this earlier, but I think we're now seeing a lot more evidence of this. And the Russian people are too, through the recent video made by Alexei Navalny, who has emerged as being, really the most serious threat to Putin and to his position in a very long time. Because, eventually all systems run out of steam. Russia's been running out of economic steam. The 20-year project of renewal has kind of hit a wall. And, it's not clear that Putin is the right man for the next part of the 21st century to take Russia forward. So, I mean, that's just a kind of a quick overview of where we are. But again, in terms of strategic empathy, it's very important to understand who Putin is, where he came from, how he rose up, and how he sees the world. And that was one of the reasons that I, along with my colleague Clifford Gaddy, wrote the book Mr. Putin, Operative in the Kremlin. Number one, he's an operative. He moved up, and that's the way he thinks. He's a planner. He's a smart guy and should never be underestimated. And he always has a plan or an idea of a plan. But he's also, somebody who has limitations. And we tried in that book to, kind of scope out what his worldview would be. Thinking about the origins of his childhood and, kind of his career, the places he went. He never spent any time in the West. The closest he got was Dresden, which was then in East Germany. He speaks very good German, but he has a very specific perspective on the world and a very specific worldview. And that's part of strategic empathy, is understanding that. And if we had understood that early on, as General McMaster had said, we'd probably have had a different approach at the very top for dealing with Putin, because Putin doesn't think like a Western leader. He has a historic context, well, he's deeply steeped in Russian history. And we just have to understand at all times where he's coming from, as well as just, where he might be headed at the moment, given the constraints and the difficulties of governing Russia at this juncture. I'll stop there and then, be interesting to see what other people said. Now I can see, as I've been wittering on, you got 11. 11 questions.
No, Fiona, that's a great question.
We want to ask a question.
What a great explanation of the competition that we're facing with Putin and with Russia. I mean, and some great questions are coming in, as you can see. I'm just your final comment. I'll just make a comment that I think strategic narcissism does lead to mirror imaging and an optimism bias and confirmation bias, cognitive traps that we fall into if we don't apply strategic empathy. Tyler asked, "Hey, what do you look for in an ambassador? Who do you think President Biden ought to appoint as an ambassador to Russia?" I'm thinking of, I think President Trump made a great choice in Ambassador Huntsman. He was phenomenal in a very, very difficult position. Of course, a seasoned statesman, had been ambassador to China before, and was extremely good in a very difficult environment. What are your thoughts on, what do you look for in an ambassador, and do you have anybody in mind who would be good in Moscow these days?
I think Ambassador Sullivan, who replaced Ambassador Huntsman, has been doing a pretty good job as well, with somebody who was, sort of steeped in the State Department and was a good kind of, interim choice. If we actually look back, I think the United States has been very fortunate with its ambassadors. We've had, some really good people who had a very deep background in Russia, who knew their stuff. So that where, ambassadors have been less successful than others, it's really just been a question of timing. And I think this is difficult timing. And as I said, Ambassador Huntsman was perfect for the choice of the moment when we were thinking about the rise of China, but it actually turned out to be not great timing for someone like him. Honestly, it actually might be almost better to ask Ambassador Huntsman to come back now, although I greatly doubt that he would like to, given,
it wasn't good timing for anybody, I don't think.
No, I think that was kind of the problem, because, dealing with Russia on China is going to be quite difficult. And I'll just talk very briefly about that, because there was an assumption under the Trump administration, and I think you alluded to this in your overview, that Russia would just automatically want to be with the West and the United States in opposition to China, and that's just not the case at all. In fact, Russia would rather have us as the enemy, as a way of protecting itself from being stuck on its own with China. The Russians don't want, like anybody else, to be up against just China as the dominant player, because Russia's got an incredibly vulnerable border with who? China. The North, Russia just has the Arctic Ocean. China's already also trying to take advantage of the melting of the sea ice to do polar expeditions and sort of move into there, as it has done in the Antarctic. And, apart from its borders with European countries, which honestly Russia is no longer, so concerned about, even though they talk about, the threat from the West, It's really that vulnerability of the East, where it has a very low population density. It still has kind of natural resource rich, but it has this push, demographic pressure from China. Now, kind of would China take Russian territory? This is actually something that's always at the back of Russia's mind. And in 2000, 20 years ago, one of the first acts of Putin was to reinforce the strategic partnership, friendship ideas with China that Yeltsin had undertaken along with the Central Asian countries, because they were really worried about Chinese, not just encroachment of Chinese people crossing over the border and acquiring land and investing, but the idea that on old maps of China, lots of large swathes of their territory were in, the idea of imperial China. And as we know, China never forgets in terms of its old territorial reach. And a lot of the Russian Far East was seized from China at moments of Chinese vulnerability, when European powers were also predating on Chinese territory back in the 1860s. So that whole region north of the Amur River, the Russian Far East was, at one point Chinese territory. And on a lot of Chinese maps, it's still there, marked as such. And while China may be preoccupied with the South China Seas, Taiwan, and other issues, eventually it might turn its attention to there. So it's much better for Russia to have us as an enemy and make a big show about it, because it's like, we're going to beat up on Russia, on the United States, Russia, and just don't you get any ideas, because see how tough we are. It's no good just beating on Estonia or Georgia or some of the other countries they have in the past. If you don't have a formidable, worthy enemy, others might think that you're soft, and weak, and that, might, kind of start to push on those vulnerabilities. So that's also going on all the time in the back of Putin's head. The Japanese see the same thing. Often, Russia beats up on the Japanese. They've been trying for years to resolve the territorial dispute with the northern territories, the Kuril Islands. And every time they think they get somewhere, the Russians pull back and do something, kind of unexpected for the Japanese. It's because I think that they, want to signal to China that they're not going to give up an inch of territory. And, China may reinvigorate claims as it did in the past, because Russia's done the same. Russia's reinvigorated claims against Crimea, even though at different points it recognized that Crimea was part of Ukraine because of the administrative switch of Crimea under Ukraine during the Soviet period. So you've got to, again, think, how are they thinking about all of this? So beating up on us signals China. And that means that, when we think about an ambassador, we have to have someone there who can think about all of these different issues, somebody who can represent the United States in a meaningful way, but someone who the Russians can take seriously and that they knows their stuff. So again, I would actually have said that Ambassador Huntsman would be perfect for now, because he would understand, China and understand, the preoccupations that Russia has. But then sort of thinking of someone who has that capacity. I will actually say that at one point I had a sort of a fantasy, this is years back, of sending out Arnold Schwarzenegger. And the reason I thought about that was, former governor of California, kind of a cross, Republican, Democratic, somebody who is Republican, but not partisan in a major way, an open book. We all know what he's been up to, even in his personal life. He speaks German. And, he's as tough, as they come. And, Putin's obsessed with bodybuilding, with speaking German. And they're of the same, rough generation of, the kind of people who, kind of grew up in that post-war period. And I could just imagine that it would be, kind of very difficult for the Russians to kind of like try to make fun of Arnold Schwarzenegger or do some of the usual tricks they do to try to diminish this, because he has, something of a cult following internationally. So, kind of that, for one point, I thought, he would make a great ambassador, for example. So it's thinking about a person who can be in the moment and can stand up to the moment is what we need to do, rather than a specific individual.
Well, I'm coming to you from California, obviously. And the former governor's been a strong voice out here too for unity and bringing Americans together. I think he sent a very positive message for those who haven't seen it. If you go to my Twitter feed, you can find my my retweet of Governor Schwarzenegger's message after the 6th January assault on the Capitol. Hey, Amy asks, hey, what after we experience an attack from Russia, how do we find areas of cooperation? What do we do after that? And I'm reminded, Fiona, of the confidential trip that we took to Geneva and met Mr. Patrushev, who was Putin's right-hand man. And our approach was to try to transcend the ongoing competition by focusing on our vital interests, mapping our vital interests, exploring certainly where they overlapped and were consistent, but where they diverged as well, so we could manage that divergence and avoid what would be a disastrous conflict, for example. And it was striking because that meeting occurred just, I think, a week after our forces and partner forces had clashed with Russian mercenaries in Syria. So, but you know what, the overall question Amy is asking, okay, what do you do when you're faced with a Russia who is engaged in active subversion of us? What kind of a dialogue do we have? And I will add, by the way, too, I'd just like to mention, John Sullivan is a great person, and I'm so glad that I saw that the Biden administration asked him to stay on as ambassador there for now. So, but how do you cooperate when you're in the midst of a competition, Fiona?
Well, I think you also pointed out something very important there. I mean, it wasn't intended, but the fact that we went out to meet with Nikolai Patrushev and his team against the backdrop of what had just happened with Syria was important. Because what happened in Syria, as you are more than anyone aware, is that we had laid down some very clear rules of engagement that we'd also telegraphed to the Russian military. We'd made it clear that if there was any attack on our forces, that our forces would fire back. And of course, we had very careful systems of deconfliction with the Russian military, not just in Syria but elsewhere. You know, building on some of those interactions going back to the Cold War. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, you know, Russian and U.S. military commanders, you know, talking about things. But what happened there was this paramilitary forces that were outside of the remit of the Russian military, who also weren't really informed about what they were up to, who fired on our troops. And of course, they got fired back on with disastrous consequences. And we were able to point to that, to saying how important that was to have those rules of engagement. And I mean, they knew it as well. And I think that that kind of answers part of the question that Amy asked as well, that we have to be very clear about the rules of the game, that we have to basically push back and defend ourselves. So, you know, we've had this massive cyber attack, and we have to have an offensive defense. We don't have to necessarily go out there and just play them at their own game, but I think that that's revealed some of our vulnerabilities. Now we have to do an awful lot of work. You know, some of those vulnerabilities of our own making, you know, I mean, allowing our own, you know, kind of hacking tools that the National Security Agency, you know, lost, you know, control of. I mean, this has been very well publicly documented. You know, we've got a lot of work ourselves to do to clean up our own act. And that's kind of, you know, would in itself, you know, help us to then engage while we're building up and rebuilding our own defenses on areas that actually of mutual necessity, not just of interest. And I can think of a couple here. Arms control is one. I mean, we already just agreed with them to extend the New START agreement, but we've got to move on to the 21st century of arms control, because it's not the 1980s anymore. And it's a very difficult, complex world. And Russia also has interests in preventing the proliferation of nuclear weapons. So we're actually on the same page as they are on many issues here. It's not just a question of ripping up treaties where they've been violating it and we've got disagreements. It's how do we both manage a very complicated nuclear world where China is building up a strategic arsenal, which Russia won't be feeling comfortable about. But you've also got Pakistan and India, which are not that far away from Russia, as nuclear powers that could easily end up in a nuclear conflagration. You've got Iran that's trying to blackmail, you know, other powers with the development of nuclear weapons, like Israel, for example. And Russia is extremely invested in Israel's security. That was something I think we've all learned, you know, in our time in office, is how vested Russia actually is in Israel these days. Very different from the Soviet past, because of the large Russian-speaking Israeli minorities, like minorities now part of the Israeli fabric of the population, a good million more people and multiple generations with heritage of Soviet Jewry who emigrated to Israel. And then there's also, you know, of course, North Korea, which is right on the border of Russia in that Russian Far East, that vulnerable zone. And it totally messed up Russia's whole strategic play in Northeast Asia when Kim Jong-un, you know, started firing off rockets all over the place, because Russia had been trying to, you know, sell itself to Japan, South Korea, and other regional players as a force for stability. And then you've got, you know, basically Kim Jong-un, you know, upsetting the whole apple cart. Russia doesn't really have a role there, and it's left to the US and China. So Russia's, you know, quite uncomfortable about this new nuclear age and does want to work with us. It doesn't necessarily want to work with us in the same way we might want it to go, things to go, but there is an interest for Russia to work there, just as there is for us to try to find a way of stabilizing this complex nuclear environment. And then look, there's the pandemic and the global vaccination. And I think we've got to get over ourselves and stop playing vaccine nationalism and looking at the vaccine as a political issue. Thank God they've developed a vaccine is all I can say if Sputnik works. This is Sputnik, the vaccine, as opposed to the radio program disinformation, which is a different thing, or the satellite. Because Russia in the past has been at the forefront of medical research on vaccines. You know, they help with polio and the eradication of polio, you know, throughout most of the world, although it's not complete. They help with the eradication of smallpox. They've developed all kinds of treatments for multi-drug resistance tuberculosis. They've got, you know, a much vaunted and, you know, well-deserved reputation in scientific research in the medical field, in vaccination field. We should embrace that. And not kind of, you know, I'd take the Sputnik vaccine, you know, if it's, as the Lancet's suggesting, that it's been proven to work. We've got a whole world to vaccinate. So I think that that's kind of, we have to think about this and think, okay, that's an area where clearly for the you know, sake of humanity, we should work together. So those are just a few examples.
Hey, thanks, Fiona. Okay, we have 10 minutes left. We're going to try to do three questions.
Sorry, I'm talking too long.
No, it's good. These are complicated issues, and your answers are so great. Hey, so Raphael's asking about how do you work with Europe on Russia, and what are your thoughts on what more Russia can do to deter Russian new generation warfare or gray zone conflict? Of course, you have certain countries have been on the front lines of this and have done quite well. Estonia, after the 2007 denial of service attacks, has probably the best cyber defense program, small scale, and much of it is maybe not easily scalable to like the United States. Finland, you know, has that center for countering essentially Russian new generation warfare that is doing some of the best thinking about it. Other countries who are on the front line are adamantly, you know, opposed to Russian new generation warfare, like Poland. Others seem to have been co-opted, like Hungary and certainly Serbia. So what are your thoughts about Europe broadly? Germany and Nord Stream 2, right? Okay, so it's a lot, but what are your, just if you quickly, Europe and countering Russian new generation warfare?
Well, I think it's essential, first of all. We have to, you know, beef up our commitment to working with NATO on this. You know, we got bogged down in fights over, you know, kind of 2% of GDP payments to NATO, instead of really kind of thinking, well, what would we do with that funding? So this would be, you know, kind of one area of really thinking about how NATO tackles this. And we've, you know, got some new instruments and new arrangements inside of NATO. But I think you just touched upon it. We've also got to find, you know, task forces and groupings of countries that, you know, are used to working very closely with Russia and in tackling this that we work with too. We shouldn't just have the same old approach. And you, you know, General McMaster, while you were at the National Security Council, did try to create up these groupings of like-minded countries that weren't just the traditional Germany, you know, France and the UK, or, you know, with an addition perhaps of Italy or the EU. We have to find, I think, you know, ways of working together with, like you said, the Finns, the Estonians, the Norwegians, the Swedes, the Danes, the Dutch, the Swiss, you know, all of whom have got all kinds of, you know, different parts of this. And we also have to work on figuring out how to clean up our own act, you know, on making it more difficult for Russians to spread dirty money, which is part of this new generation of warfare. It's not just cyber attacks, but spreading of dirty money around Europe as well. So working with the European Union, particularly on, you know, stamping out financial crimes, anti-money laundering, you know, legislation, things that we can kind of do together is going to be pretty critical.
And just to quickly answer Adam's question, you know, I think Nord Stream 2 is a big deal, right? In terms of giving Russia coercive power over the energy sector in Europe. I don't think it's in Germany's interests. You know, there's a lot of corruption allegedly involved in this, you know, with a former chancellor involved in the deal. And I think Germany's got to get kind of stiffen its spine a little bit here, especially after the Navalny poisoning and how that was, there was so much at the forefront of that with his treatment. But Nord Stream 2 it would be, I think, a way to impose costs, as we had mentioned, you know, far beyond those that Russia factors in at the outset. Hey, I want to get to Kayla's question, because Fiona, your voice was so powerful on this point in your testimony. And she's asking, hey, what is the role of identity politics in the polarization of our society? What can we do about it? You know, I personally think it's an interaction between, you know, what some call identity politics and bigotry and racism. And I recall the work that we did on analyzing Russia's subversion of our democracy during and around and after, especially the 2016 election, and how like 80% of the IRAs, this is the Internet Research Agency, you know, the SVR cutout the Russian intelligence cutout that was so active with the bots and trolls. 80% of that was on race, right?
That's
To pit
right.
us against each other on race. A distant second was on issues of immigration, right? So what is your assessment of this interaction? What can we do about it to defend ourselves against it?
Well, we also have to remember that the Russians have been doing that for a long time as well, so it shouldn't have been so much of a shock. Back into the 1920s, the Russians and into the 1930s did also reach out to, African American groups. There's a very famous example of Paul Robeson, the famous singer, who was invited out to Russia and then, got blacklisted, later when he returned and, kind of accused of being a communist. But why did they do that? Because of the deep embedded structural racism in the United States. So first of all, we've got to address that. The Russians have been targeting this as a vulnerability for the United States for best part of a century. In fact, it will be a century around now, kind of with 2020. We have to address that ourselves and realize, what a stain that is on, the American civic fabric. So, clearly we can do an awful lot to, address, the discriminatory practices within the United States. Coming from, abroad as I did in 1989, it was a big shock to me when I, saw the depths of racism and racial inequality in the United States. I hadn't expected it. 30 years of here, I've now seen that, for myself, and at work, and we've got a lot to do. And if we tackle that ourselves, it gives, kind of less opportunity for Russia to deal with that. But then there's also socioeconomic divisions here that actually transcend race. And we've got to be able to kind of like figure out how to get democracy to deliver again. And Putin himself exploited the fact that as far as Russians were concerned in the 1990s, democracy didn't deliver because democracy became associated with free markets. And the reason it didn't deliver in Russia was because a rule of law wasn't implemented and oligarchs stole a lot of the money. And most of the Russian people in the 1990s were fairly impoverished, and they became more susceptible then to kind of populist, heavy-handed authoritarian politics. And that's really what we've happened in the United States. So we need to have an at-scale sustainable development approach to all of this as well. To look at the grievances of low-income, working class Americans. That's actually what my book is about, in fact, because I came out of my experience in the government and out of the testimony and the depositions from the first impeachment trial in 2019, deeply worried about this very issue of divisions in the United States. It wasn't what the Russians did in 2016, what was the problem. It was what Americans were doing to each other and our failure to address our own internal problems. And that's what Russia was exploiting. So there's a socioeconomic dimension to this, not just the issues of, race or gender or any other question as well.
Well, I think that we have this in our hands, right? We are in a democratic system that, in which we do have a say in how we're governed, and our founders never thought that we would be perfect, that our republic would require constant nurturing. And I do think this is one of those areas, right, where we can break this interaction between identity politics and bigotry and racism, mainly through empathy, right? And having discussions where we first talk about what we can agree on. Hey, who's against inequality of opportunity? I mean, like, how can you be against that, right? So I think, I think there's a lot of work we can do, Fiona. I think it's a really positive message, actually, that in our democracy, we can talk about our shortcomings. We can talk about, what we need to do to get better. In Russia, they don't have that opportunity to do that, at least, unfettered, certainly not in China, right? So I think this is an opportunity for us to regain some of that confidence lost maybe, and hopefully that, 6 January was the nadir, of this experience, right? And we can come toget're.
So it's strategic empathy at home, not just abroad, is what we need. Exactly right. Yeah.
Absolutely. Hey, there's so many great questions, and I'm sorry we're not going to get to all of them. I want to give you kind of the last word on what would you say to students who are looking at the prospects of government service, right? It looks like kind of a sharp elbows, to put it, lightly, environment, right? And, you and I were both subjects of attacks by certain people in cyberspace and in social media, attacks that actually were reinforced by Russians and so forth. And so it looks like, hey, there's a downside for sure to service. I thought you might share what your philosophy is of serving, and what you might say to encourage those who are looking at opportunities to serve our country, to serve their communities, and then we'll wrap up with that, Fiona.
Well, first of all, I mean, the real antidote to populism, where somebody, always kind of like Vladimir Putin and, unfortunately, President Trump has done the same thing, claims to speak and be the only person who can speak in the name of the people. The antidote is to that is to return to the idea of we the people having our own agency, which is just what you touched upon. And so serving your country is one of the best ways you can do that, to have your own agency, to have a say in government. I mean, how much better than to actually try to join government in some way. And the point in this is you can do this many different ways. You said at the very beginning, General McMaster, that I did it by being on loan actually from the Brookings Institution. I went into government the first time on an interpersonal, loan actually. I mean, basically academic institutions, American University can do this as well, can loan people out for a couple of years. The last time I took a leave, but we have all kinds of institutional arrangements that enable you to do this. There's all kinds of fellowships and internships, but there's also, like you did, joining the military. In fact, the plurality, I would say, of people in the federal government today are military veterans. People who, like you did, went to West Point or, Annapolis, or they signed up in, kind of mainstream recruitment office, or they joined the ROTC at university. And then when they retired, they wanted to go back into service, keep on serving the country, but as civilians. There's also ways of, looking on, USA jobs online and, kind of finding a way of joining in through the civil service. But there's also community and local and state government. And I think, what everybody should think of today is, what can we do? This is the anniversary of JFK, John F. Kennedy's call to service. Ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. And there are so many things that we can do. So all kinds of levels of volunteering, be it in a church or another, kind of faith group, helping at your local food bank. I have friends who have joined up to be EMTs, which has actually become quite dangerous during COVID, and are now helping, kind of trained, to give people vaccines, people as contract tracers. There are down at my, local Bethesda rescue station, there are people helping out with food banks. Back at home, my 80-odd-year-old mother, I mean, she's almost 87, has been helping in her local church. I mean, she couldn't during the pandemic, but now all of the elderly are getting vaccinated. They can go back in to help with crisis centers and food banks. There's just so much that you can do, and you can build up on that. And I think, this is the kind of inflection point that we are in the United States. There's legislation being looked at to, come up with a year of voluntary service. There are ideas of people going across the country, through a kind of a, expansion of AmeriCorps, going from, say, Washington, D.C. to Iowa, or from an Iowa to Louisiana, so that people can work in a different community. Habitat for Humanity, kind of Teach for America. There are all kinds of different ways that I think that people can give back. And we should all start to do that, because that's how you build up a career in service and in giving back.
Well, Fiona, I couldn't think of a better way to end this. Thank you so much for being with us. Thanks for your example and for your service. Thanks to all of you who joined. A special thanks to Olivia Gavedin and David Brostoff for helping put this together. Please sign up for the rest of the series. I wish we could be there in person, because every time I interact with our young students, Fiona, I mean, it bolsters my confidence, right? So in our future. So thanks to all of you for joining, and thanks to the Sign Fellowship and Institute for the opportunity. Fiona, take care. It was wonderful to see you.
That's great. Thanks so much, and best of luck to everyone. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Take care, everybody. Bye.